When Eric asked me to do this, God, whenever it was, almost a year ago, I was happy to do it in part because I have been working, somewhat oddly, working on this project called Wisconsin 101 for it's now been 5 years. And I'll tell you a little bit where that idea came from. It is, I think, an interesting twist on all this Wisconsin idea stuff that you all have been talking about. Actually, this course has been going on for 3 years now, right? This is the third year, right. I see that Chad doesn't. Chad Goldberg was the first person to do it, and then you've done it for the past 2, right?
I did it second, and
Tom's doing the third. I want to start by talking just a little bit about the place of history in the Wisconsin idea, and I won't dwell on this at length, but I'm hoping actually to get a discussion started that you might want to respond to. In one measure, to me, and what Tom didn't say is during 2 of my 3 years on the university committee, I was also representative to the UW Board of Regents and Systems. So I did a lot of traveling around the state and got very interested in the politics of higher education because it was a very interesting time to be doing that. But one of the things, in some sense, the Wisconsin idea is, since we're in a mixed company, I won't say what I really think, is a little bit of balderdash because it is, after all, it arises out of a sentiment which can be traced back to something like the Hatch Act, which created agricultural extension, agricultural experiment stations, and kind of and I'm sure you guys probably talked about it at some point, right? Eric nods. That was what?
Yeah, Bill Tracy.
Oh, Bill was here last week? Oh, he doesn't know anything about that. But anyway, he's not here? No, he's not. Okay. But for Wisconsin to claim that it's delivering the fruits of its research to the rest of the state is nothing other than any other public university claims to do. And the fact that you've got a little plaque saying this is like what we do is, I think, slightly disingenuous when it's nothing different than what Purdue or Michigan State or U of I and Champaign-Urbana does. Now, of course, a lot of that research is basically arranged around science-related research, and the original intent of agricultural extension, as Bill probably told you, was to both help farmers be more productive and get kind of the latest both scientific information from genetics or from crop fertility, as well as there was a home economics side, right? There was a side that taught housewives to run their households more efficiently, better techniques for canning or food preparation, all sorts of stuff. History wasn't part of that original goal, in part because history represents a different kind of expertise. So in the sciences, the scientists working in laboratory settings or out in the field, if they're agricultural scientists, are producing knowledge which is sort of based upon their own specialized knowledge of, say, crop fertility, of crop genetics or soil fertility or so on. A historian, however, also has specialized knowledge, but it only succeeds if that knowledge is basically, succeeds in persuading the reader that the story told by the historian is a persuasive one. In other words, whereas a scientist can say, look, this is what I know, you can believe it or not, a historian cannot do that. A historian can only succeed if the stories told are persuasive to the reader. They have to become the reader's story. And of course, that's why history exists. It's the way of organizing our sense of experience in terms of how we got where we are. And that's why, if you look at the whole university or environment, the 4 oldest disciplines by far are astronomy, mathematics, history, and philosophy. Those are the ones that long, long predated the earliest universities and go right back to the beginnings of recorded history. And there's an obvious reason why people do that, because they use these narratives to organize experience. Now, all that being said, it is conspicuous that University of Wisconsin does not have a public history presence in the history department. UW-Milwaukee has a public history program. UW-La Crosse has a public history program, but Madison never has. And I don't know all the reasons for that. I suspect I know a few of them, but I don't actually know if it's ever, for example, whether it ever came up in the history department. So all that is a kind of long preamble to describing where this project came from at a school which does not do public history. It began, as Tom said, in 2013 when I met my colleague on this project, Sarah Thal, who's a professor in the history department for the first time. And Sarah and I met in the way that many, many people do nowadays, not through Tinder, but on a committee. And it was a hiring committee for an undergraduate advisor doing career advice. And as Sarah and I got to know each other, we began to, now let me just point out, Sarah is a person who does 19th century Japanese history, and I do early modern European history. I'm basically an Enlightenment historian. So neither of us are American historians. And we began talking about the problems of presenting history to undergrads. Now, let me remind you, back in 2013, we were still washing through the after effects of the economic collapse of 2008. And at that time, as anyone who was here knows, there was this tremendous talk going on around education, and that it had to be oriented towards getting people jobs in really bad markets. And I don't think there's any doubt that the students who came out in the humanities end of liberal arts and sciences were suffering the worst. Those were the jobs that were hardest to get. And even if those jobs weren't necessarily impossible to get, you had to be here to sort of interact with college graduates in 2008 to realize how really bleak their view of the world was. And why not? I mean, it was just a horrible time. So Sarah and in fact, I think it's still the case that there's just thousands of students who come to UW-Madison every fall thinking they're going to be pre-med students, or they're going to go into some healthcare. And I think that is still a trailing effect of that economic collapse. Parents push their kids toward that kind of career because they want the kids to have some economic security. And then they wash out of Chem 103 and 104, and then they go find other stuff to do. And that's why we're building an addition to the chemistry building so even more people can wash out of Chem 103, 104. That's the way UW-Madison operates. So Sarah and I were discussing this problem, and as you know, it still is the case, there's a ton of rhetoric in public about how studying humanities is a waste of time, it doesn't give technical skills, the only thing we're studying is math or computer science or something like that, or laboratory science. So we were trying to, Sarah and I were trying to come up with ideas that would give, and there's another reason as well, is enrollments were falling in history, not just at Madison, but nationally, enrollments were plummeting. So it wasn't just a problem that the historians at Madison had, it was really a much broader problem. So Sarah and I began talking about how we might do something to give students a sense of history as having a public value, right? Why study history? And I know, as someone who taught history of science for years and taught a big history of medicine lecture course, students come out of high school often not liking history because they think it's just a lot of stupid stuff they had to memorize and presidents and so on. And they didn't really see any greater value for it. So how do you give history a sense of value to the students? So as two instructors, Sarah and I wanted to give students who are studying history a sense of its public value. What makes doing history worthwhile apart from the grade you get at the end and then you throw away the paper? Okay. A second motivation, though, as we began to think about it, was collaborative. And here, this is really kind of our spin on the Wisconsin idea. This idea came out because as a representative, as someone who was, I wasn't on the university committee at the time, but I was in the faculty senate, and I was very acutely aware of the sort of difficult position that Madison has in the rest of the state. And it was also the case that in 2013, there was a lot of division in the state. The effects of Act 10 had already been washed through, and there was a great deal of tumult and uproar in Wisconsin over both the actions of Scott Walker and the legislature, but also the sort of great divides that have been written about and talked about so much. And so we wanted to try and do something that might bring people together into a sense of belonging to a single community. And it struck us that one way to do it would be to not use Wisconsin idea in a sense of we're producing something and then just distributing it over the rest of the state, but rather to create a collaborative network. And so that's where the idea came to us to actually to institute, as I say here, institute public history as a form of crowdsourcing. We're not going to write your stories. We're going to invite you to write stories that become part of this site. So this collaborative idea, not really identical to the way most Wisconsin idea projects are conceived, was important to us as well. And then the third one was also, I think, kind of interesting and novel, and that was to integrate, to mount local histories on a statewide basis. And those of you who aren't historians may not appreciate this point, but a lot of public history is done in local settings, or it's done on statewide settings. There's a wonderful public historian at Whitewater, James Levy is his name, and he's been doing for several years a terrific project doing oral histories of farming by different ethnic groups in Wisconsin. So his students have gone around, and he's enrolled some students from Madison to do this too, going around and interviewing people about different practices of farming by different ethnic groups. It's a wonderful project. And it's done on a statewide basis as much as he's got the resources to do it. But it's rare to see local history that's both local and simultaneously statewide. And it was partly growing out of our collaborative intention that we sort of tried to mount it that way. So we wanted to mount local histories on a statewide basis. So these were the principal goals. I'm not going to say that we had these ideas fully formed in the beginning. In fact, we sort of spent well more than a year just trying to get straight what we were trying to do. One of the key inspirations for the project was the very well-known project mounted by the British Museums, The History of the World. Actually, it's A History of the World in 100 Objects. This was published in 2010. It was a museum exhibit, first in the British Museum, and then it came out as a very well-known book. Here's the British Museum's homepage. What the British Museum basically did is rummage around the basement and pull out stuff and say, here it is. And it was, what made this, by the way, this is the homepage. It feels like you ought to be able to click on each of those things and go straight to one of the objects, but it's just kind of a quilt. I mean, it's just a picture. There's nothing there. But right, I should have, let's see, where's the, right up there, the third object down in this row is that it? That's the only one from the upper Midwest. It is a map of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers written on a deerskin from the 1700s. It's kind of an interesting story. But you can tell from here, most of this, this goes back to archaeology. Most of this stuff is from ancient times, ancient India, ancient China, ancient Greece. I mean, those places. There's very little modern stuff. What made this project distinctive was that each object became the centerpiece as well of a 15-minute segment that was broadcast on BBC4, one of the domestic networks. And then later made available as podcasts. You can still listen to them. And these podcasts are sort of, and they were all written by Neil McGregor, who was the director of the British Museum at the time. I cannot imagine what it was like to write 100 15-minute scripts. That's a lot of writing. As typical with the BBC, the radio segments featured very high production values, a lot of background music, and very highly produced stuff. And as you might have told by looking at the home page, that's why I showed it to you, the project was not conceived primarily as an online exhibit. The online part of it is just sort of an afterthought to make, especially the podcast, available. In fact, the British Museum's part of it is just kind of skeletal. It's meant to direct you to the BBC's part where you can get the recordings. If you ever want to listen to something interesting, you should go back and listen to the podcast of Object Number 1, which is a sarcophagus from Egypt from about the, I don't know, 3rd or 4th century AD. What's interesting is that the very first thing, so let me ask you this. In such a project like this, where they've been looting stuff from all over the world, what do you suppose the British Museum has to do first in this big series?
Apologize?
Sort of. They do. They have to issue a worldwide mea culpa for having all this stuff. And then they have to say, but you're not getting it back. And so on the first one is really interesting because they have to sort of set the stage by saying, okay, we got all this stuff. And then they get a couple scholars from Cairo saying, oh, I think it's wonderful that the British have these things. So the politics are quite interesting. And actually, many of those, I've listened to probably a couple dozen of them. They're really quite interesting. Okay, so one inspiration was the history of the world in 100 objects. A second inspiration came from the Maine Historical Society, the state of Maine Historical Society. I'm going to run through this quickly. By the way, this talk was, I just did a webinar for the Wisconsin Historical Society, a statewide webinar. And so that's what I did. So this is a little more designed for museum curators than you guys are probably interested in, so I'll condense some parts of this. When I was first searching around for models of how to do this kind of simultaneously local and statewide thing, I came across this thing, the Maine Memory Network. This is the web page of the Maine Memory Network. And what the state of Maine did was basically it was the outgrowth of a statewide Maine community historical project. Notice it was the state sponsorship of community histories. With the Maine Memory Network, that is that website, providing the site where local histories would be collected. Now, in fact, it's not very clear where they get collected. It's actually here under exhibits. The share local history is just an exhorting readers to do it. The place where these stories are collected is here under exhibits and uploaded stories. And so you can read about blueberries and lobsters and potatoes and all that stuff you get from Maine. But it is a place, in fact, where all these local stories were available on a statewide platform. And that I found very intriguing. As things evolved, the site also began allowing the uploading of personal narratives, creation of mini exhibits. It sort of adapted itself to become even more user-driven. And so one of the things that happened in the Maine Memory Network is you began getting these stories. This is actually a poem written by one of their contributors. Here is a woman's recollection of Mercy Hospital. I can't remember where that is, if it's in Augusta or Portland or somewhere. So you're getting all this kind of mix of stuff, right? And it has a little bit of the feel of StoryCorps, that thing that's been running on NPR since like 1920. So the Maine Memory Network has been driven by this same idea of being crowdsourced. And I found this is, as of 4 years ago, this was the only example of this thing I could find anywhere. So it really is quite distinctive. Now the drawbacks of the Maine Memory Network are kind of clear. Although the stories got uploaded to the site, they just kind of sat there with no sense of an integration into larger state history. The stories aren't tagged in a way that allows you to kind of gather them. It says, show me everything about potatoes or something like that, or lobster. The stories are often quite long. They can be 2,000 or 3,000 words. And when you see 2,000 or 3,000 words on a website, what you're doing is scrolling, right? It's like reading it's like reading the Torah or something, except you're going down and not across. And there's also, as additional functions have been added, has made the website, this is the typical problem with websites, right? As they start doing more, they don't get fundamentally redesigned because that's expensive, so you just add more stuff, and they become kind of crowded and difficult to navigate. So part of our inspiration did come from the Maine Memory Network, but what we wanted to sort of have a site that could do a lot more in terms of linking stories. Now, the centerpiece of Wisconsin 101 is what we call object histories, and this goes back to the inspiration from the history of the world in 100 objects. And I was telling Tom before, I'm not a material culture. I'm an intellectual historian, right? If it's not ideas on paper, it's not of interest to me in history. So it took me an awful long time to kind of put my head enough into teaching material culture and reading material culture to be able to do this at all. And I began doing it as a kind of honors section of my basic history of medicine course, and then I did a couple of undergrad honors courses around this project, and a couple of things loaded onto the site were done by undergrads who worked with me. So that helped me think through the project and help us also understand the kind of things that, that the site can do. So here's the home page. I'm actually going to pull up the home page from the screen. What you see is basically this title page, and then you get these latest stories. This is one from Lake Koshkonong, which is down near Fort Atkinson. This is actually based on a story about a barn in New Glarus. And this one about slavery in Wisconsin was based on mining in the area around Platteville. And especially the roles of African Americans who were brought as slaves to Wisconsin before the Civil War. That is, they were not ever released from slavery during the time they were in Wisconsin. Wisconsin 101, therefore, was created from the beginning as an online exhibit. And instead of focusing on individual objects in succession and in isolation, in our case, each object stands at the center of what we call an object cluster. And I'll explain what that is in just a second. Then, objects and stories are linked into larger groupings by tagging posts and cross-referencing them with hyperlinks to the extent that we can. And as that has created some of its own growing problems, which I'll explain a little bit later on. But in other words, the idea was to create an online exhibit that you could wander through at will. You can just sort of click on stuff and wander around. Or you can say, give me everything on immigration, or give me everything on sports and recreation, or something like that. So it's meant both to be browsable, kind of serendipitous, but also organized by region, by topic, and so on. And our intention from the beginning was less of a highbrow and more of a popular field. We wanted not to speak to people who were already deeply engaged in this subject, but instead to kind of draw casual readers. And that's an issue that I want to come back to as well. And stories from Wisconsin 101 have been featured since basically we went live, have been featured on Wisconsin Public Radio's Wisconsin Life series. They were running about one a month. And lately that slowed down for various reasons, in part because our own posting of new objects slowed down. So there is the same kind of relationship with Wisconsin Public Radio that the British Museums Project had. But these are only 3 minutes long. These are not 15-minute podcasts. All right, so an object cluster consists basically of a museum-labeled description of the object. It's exactly the sort of thing you'd see if you saw the object in a museum. A short description, maybe what it's made of, how old it is, that kind of thing. And then the second part of the cluster are 2 or 3 stories connected to the object. These stories, it says there are 500 words each. That's not, they're usually more like 700 to 800 words, but fairly short. You're not scrolling to get to the end of it. And in each case, every one of the objects is linked to a story that associates the object with some place in particular in Wisconsin. That's been sort of a fundamental principle for us. Every object has to be an object that tells a story about one part of the state or another part of the state. One city, one region, something like that. In some cases, the stories present biographies of people who created the object or used it. That can be done. And in some cases, the stories link the object with broader themes in U.S. history. So that's not always the case, but in some cases it's kind of obvious to talk about what the object is doing as part of this story. One good example is the Vulcan Bowling Pin. This bowling pin was made by the Vulcan Lumber Company in Antigo. If you don't know where Antigo is, it's in the north to the east of Wausau. And in the 1950s, Vulcan began producing what became the standard bowling pin as accepted by the American Bowling Congress. Has a plastic coating on it. And so Joe Hermelin, by the way, all of our contributions are authored, which is not always the case on the web. There's a lot of stuff on the web that isn't attributed to anybody. Joe Hermelin wrote about this, and here he's giving you an object history, which is also kind of a company history, a broader history of the Vulcan bowling pin. But then what Joe did, along with this story, is he links it to several other stories. How Milwaukee became the bowling capital of America as the headquarters of the American Bowling Congress. And he's got stories about the kind of leagues that were in Milwaukee. And he's got another story that he wrote about bowling in Japan. This made my colleague Sarah very happy. I mentioned she's a Japanese historian. In the wake of the Second World War, there was a big boom of bowling in Japan. And it again fueled the market for Vulcan Bowling Company's product, right? Bowling pins were exported to Japan at this time. By the way, if you look at this webpage, it has the most stunning photograph of an abandoned bowling alley in Yokohama, Japan. And it's just an amazing picture. Oh, you know what? We've got time. I'm just going to show it to you because it's so cool. Here, we're going to pause just for a second and go here. Oh, let's see. Let's see if it's on this. There it is. Let's see if we can get to, come on. What's wrong with where's the cursor? Come on, cursor. I've been having a little trouble with this. Uh-oh. Come on. All right, now I've done it. All right, I'm not going to mess around. Oh, there it is. It's back again. That's weird.
I can try, although...
no, that's right. No, that's okay. I got it.
Okay.
Check this out, kids. Oh, no. Wait, I got to get back to this picture. Come on. No, I'll get it. Sorry, now I'm really wasting your time. All right, we're going to try one more time. Oh, it's not showing. Okay, forget it. Sorry about that. Check it out, if you would. It's a beautiful picture. So we've got a bunch of stories linked to this. Maybe when I end the slideshow, I'll show you this picture because it's really quite something. Now, I'm not going to go through this a lot. This was the stuff that was intended mainly for the curators, the museum people that were participating in this webinar. But I want to point out that one obvious way to link an object with a place is to look at objects that were manufactured by Wisconsin companies, right? Because those are automatically localized. So one of our most iconic objects is the West Bend penguin server. This was it's about this big. My wife gave me one for Christmas a couple of years ago. It's just a little aluminum hot and cold server with the typical thermos two thin plates with an airspace in between. That's how you get insulation in these things. West Bend Appliance Company during World War II had been doing military work, making aluminum things for the military. Then after the war ended, they switched back to their consumer products business, and this penguin server came out. And the person who wrote this story, a woman named Ann Glasscock, who was at the time an art history grad student, did some wonderful stuff talking about the rise of backyard barbecuing in the 1950s, this kind of suburban middle-class life in which the penguin server was sort of that kind of object. But she also talked about the West Bend Company in West Bend, Wisconsin. And there's some other stories. Interestingly, there's more such stories to come. I hope to get a story of the Nash Rambler from Kenosha. I think a student at UW-Oshkosh is writing that. And right now, I am doing a set of stories around Kohler Company and the introduction of plumbing fixtures in the late 1800s. And Kohler is a really good story because it's very rich for a whole bunch of reasons, including it's, of course, controversial because Kohler was, you know, throughout, there were two bitter strikes against Kohler, one in the 1930s and then a very long-running one that began, in, I think, in the 1950s. I'm not going to talk about the second one. So one of the reasons why I wanted to write about Kohler is a kind of test case on how to write about really controversial stuff. Ask anyone from Sheboygan about Kohler, and they'll tell you that the mere mention of the company still gets people mad, either against the union or against the company. So Kohler is one that will test our ability to talk about things that make people mad, hopefully without making them mad. Now, here's the Penguin server, the West Bend Penguin server. And again, this is the basic picture of the Penguin server, right? The basic object description of the Penguin server. And then here's another one from Horlick's Malted Milk. William Horlick came from England and created malted milk as a, do you know what malted milk began as? Anyone know what that is? It's an infant nutritional supplement. And Horlicks was the most widely sold infant nutritional supplement in the early 1900s, surpassing even the supplement offered by Nestle, the Swiss chemist who also had this supplement. So malted milk, which is now, of course, a flavoring in candy ball, you know, that sort of thing, began as something to supplement and perhaps replace breast milk. All right. The project began with the kind of objects that are typically housed in museums, but now has included many other objects, including structures or big things like the Door County Bookmobile or the SS Meteor, this cargo ship that sailed the Great Lakes, a migrant worker cabin from near Green Bay, and perhaps most dramatically at all, one of the dam towers. This is the Door County Bookmobile. There's the migrant worker cabin. There is the dam tower. If you've been to the Kickapoo Valley Reserve, you've seen this dam tower, right? This began as a federally sponsored Army Corps of Engineers dam project. And the Kickapoo Valley, they were going to build a dam across the Kickapoo River, and the whole Kickapoo Valley was going to be flooded, requiring the displacement of many, many people. And this aroused a whole lot of protest. And in fact, for reasons which I can't remember right now, the project was abandoned after the dam had been partially built. So there is this kind of weird-looking remnant of a project that never quite came off from the 1930s. So there's an object now is kind of, it's evolved away from is it bigger than a bread box kind of thinking that we might have started with. Objects we hope are visually interesting. And it turns out that many different kinds of objects are suitable for the project. We also have, for example, we have this object, a 20-sided die. Does anyone have an inkling of why a 20-sided die is on our website?
Well, the Dungeons and Dragons game, which is invented by somebody from Milwaukee?
From Lake Geneva. Gary Gygax invented this game in Lake Geneva. And Lake Geneva was also the origin of the biggest gaming convention in North America, Gen Con, which decades ago lost its connection with Geneva, but in fact it too came out of Lake Geneva. So sometimes, the die is not a great object because 20-sided dies have been around since antiquity. But it is strongly associated now with a game like Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a kind of interesting story about Dungeons and Dragons to be told about Wisconsin. Objects can also invoke interesting personal narratives. For example, this one, a pillow sham. This stories were also written up by Joe Hermelin from Antigo. This was, as the description says, Rosemary Drab created this embroidered pillow sham in commemoration of her brother's entry into the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression. And the pillow sham contains like the NRA Blue Eagle. There's sort of NRA motifs on it. So here's a case from the decorative arts, which is not, to be honest, strongly located with a particular place, but nevertheless tells you something about this moment when people would commemorate events like this by making an embroidered pillow sham. And we would love to have more such things. There's right now 2 stories about a Hmong baby carrier and baby stash, which have been recently posted. This is a case, these stories are mostly about what happened in Laos. And in my opinion, a little too little about what happened to the Hmong immigrants when they arrived in Wisconsin. I wish we had a better balance on that. But we thought that this was worth doing, right? It was worth doing because we wanted to represent that part of Wisconsin's story. And it turns out that the people who were connected with these baby carriers and baby stash settled down near La Crosse. And so we hope we can add another story about the establishment of the Hmong community in La Crosse at some point. Now, I'll just give you one other interesting little feature. Not every object that is prized by a museum would be suitable for Wisconsin 101. And there's some obvious reasons for this. The one we always talk about in talks like this is the Lincoln bedroom, which is located at the Tallman House in Janesville. Now, the story here is that in 1859, when Abraham Lincoln was running for president, he went to Milwaukee and gave a speech, and he was going to go to Beloit, I think, to give another speech, and this guy Tallman in Janesville said, "Hey, spend the night here. It's between Milwaukee and Beloit." And Lincoln said, "Okay," and he didn't have a million advance men, so he just sort of showed up. Now, so this is supposedly the bed that Lincoln slept in. And if you're in the Tallman House in Janesville, or if you're in any sort of museum that collects something that's strongly associated with an individual, the physical presence of the object gives you an indirect sense of being in contact with the person. That's why these objects are collected. And it is, I mean, it's sort of, that's what happens in the physical presence of an object. This kind of, the ghost of the person is there. On the website, however, that's kind of drained away and it just becomes, okay, well, there's a bed in a room, right? So, whereas this might be really of interest, and it is, I mean, it is a centerpiece of the tour you get at the Rock County Historical Society. For us, this is not something we'll ever do, unless we had reason to think the bed itself was special, apart from being something that Lincoln once slept in. Here's another object from the Ephraim Historical Society, which is in Door County. It's a wedding invitation to the wedding of Wallace Warfield to Earl Spencer in 1916. Here's a trivia question. Who's Wallace Warfield? Anybody know? Really? Did you study history? Well, Wallace Warfield was the future wife of Edward VIII of England, the woman for whom he gave up his throne. Don't feel bad. No one ever knows that. Except of course, Tia Thompson, who is the director of the Ephraim Historical Society. Now, in this case, she was. She got married one more time, right? She divorced that guy and then married a guy named Sid. No, it's true. It was a trick question. But, you know, if you don't listen, what do you spend your time doing if you don't memorize Wikipedia, right? So I'm not going to apologize for that. The problem here is that the invitation has no connection with Ephraim at all. It happened to go to, I mean, the reason why this invitation is interesting has nothing to do with Ephraim. Here is an invitation, I mean, she knew someone from Ephraim. I don't know if she spent a week there sometime or whatever. There's no reason to mount this thing as of interest. And because it tells you nothing about Door County or about Ephraim. The second thing is, Things with writing on them are kind of problematic for us because when you see writing, your attention is directed away from the thing, the material thing, and you're paying attention to what the writing says, right? So we've only got two things with writing on it, and one of them was a kind of a test object very early in the project. And the other is a very well-known cookbook that was produced by the settlement movement in Milwaukee in the early 1900s. But mostly things with writing on it don't work for our site. Okay. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about challenges and opportunities that the website has faced, what the project has faced. How has this worked? And the answer is, well, it's been a challenging ride. The first challenge is funding, of course. We've had basically two kinds of funding. One is the history department made available a chunk of money at the very beginning of the project to create the website that we had. And that was very important because websites cost several $1,000s to get someone who knows how to design a website to do. The other thing is that the College of Letters and Sciences, this has to be said, has supported the project with a 50% 12-month graduate project assistant for 4 years. This is now going into the 5th year. And if you know anything about the financial troubles Letters and Sciences had during this time, that is monstrously important support that shows that they believed in the project. So I want to acknowledge that. And then this past year, right now, we have a second graduate PA, which was funded by the Center for the Humanities through the Mellon Fellowship Program. So right now we have 2 PAs, and boy, are we putting them to work. As you can see up here, the website was hacked several years ago, but it was only discovered because it crashed and became unusable in the late spring of 2018. These are these bots that just go around looking for vulnerabilities, and when they discover a website they can get into, they rewrite all your links to send you to some, I don't know, Korean or Japanese, something where you're probably spending money, right? So this isn't like breaking into the Pentagon, but it is, or stealing Hillary Clinton's emails or something. It's more low level than that, but it nevertheless destroyed the site. The old site became completely unusable. And Kate Wersan, our heroic graduate PA, spent 2 months just trying to rebuild some version of the site inside the DoIT domain, Division of Information Technology, if you're not on campus. That actually has caused us to lose a lot of functionality because the way that DoIT supports WordPress is miserable. They're having so many troubles with Canvas. I mean, yeah. Well, anyway, that's another story. So we do have a website you can look at, but it's not as robust as the old one. But here's the interesting thing, and this goes back to the nature of the project from the very beginning. In a crowdsourced project, you are dependent upon your contributors. And you will not be surprised to hear that museum people have a lot better things to do than write stuff for me in many cases. Now that being said, we've gotten a good 15 or so contributions from museums around the state, historical societies and museums. But if you're going to be crowdsourced, and you're saying, well, why are you insisting on crowdsourcing? And this goes back to this very issue of the relationship between Madison and the rest of the state. When I was talking about this project early on, someone said to me, look, you've got all the resources of the State Historical Society there. You've got this vast collection of stuff. You've got the State Museum on the square. Why don't you just write this all up? You could do one object for every one of the 72 counties in the state. And my answer was, at the time, and I still believe this, my answer was because no one would be interested in that. If we sat here and dictated how this should look, it would lose that sense of kind of buy-in that we hope to get from other people. And to some extent, it has succeeded. We actually have gotten very enthusiastic reception from the various societies and museums with some contributions, but remember, they're always running on a shoestring, so what they can do is limited. So in a crowdsourced project, you need to beat the bushes for contributions. Students have been our most numerous contributors. Courses taught in Madison, at Oshkosh, La Crosse, where else, Stout, have all featured stuff. Right now, there's a course being offered by a public historian at Marquette, which we hope to get a couple of things from. Undergrad courses are good for this, except for one problem, and that is that undergrads think of their assignments in semester-like units. And if you set your course to produce an object cluster, right, an object description in 2 or 3 stories by the end of the semester, which is a reasonable assignment, at the end of the semester, the students want to turn it in and be done with it. Well, anybody who's published anything knows that that's just the beginning, because it's got to be edited, revised, edited, you know. And the students, they want to be done with it. So you got to kind of put students, and it's quite reasonable. They've gotten the grade, they want to be done with it. So although we do have undergraduate contributions, in fact, some of our best contributions come from undergrads. A couple of our best ones have. Nevertheless, it's a challenge to kind of get the students' heads into thinking, well, if you're going to do this, you're going to have more revision than you might otherwise expect. And what Sarah Thal and I underestimated was the effect of having something published, right? The incentive for the undergrads is, well, look, you're going to have something published on your CV. This is something you're going to be able to show a potential employer, say, look, you can go to that URL and see my contribution. But that doesn't figure into their thinking as much as we had hoped it would. Our biggest challenge, however, is audience. And that's because people are not nowadays drawn to websites who are not already themselves in the crowd of being interested in this kind of history. Wisconsin public radio segments have certainly driven some traffic our way. But as the project has grown and sort of matured, we've asked ourselves, how can we build an audience? And this is really, I think, an interesting problem. On the one hand, think about podcasts you listen to. Maybe you listen to some history podcasts. There are some wonderful podcasts out there. Stuff You Missed in History Class is got some great stuff on history. 99% Invisible, which is a very well-known podcast series, often does stuff on history. But these are 30-minute deep dives into a subject that often really go to people who already have a well-developed interest in this stuff, people who are willing to devote a half an hour of their lives. Now, maybe a half an hour while they're exercising or making dinner or washing dishes, but nevertheless, you're kind of focusing on this, right? Podcasts do not build audiences, I think, in the way we were seeking to. I don't want to, I may be wrong about that, but we were thinking of something else. What we were thinking of was videos, and especially videos of a much shorter 3, 4, 5-minute sort that would reach a younger audience. Podcasts tend to trend older. And this might be stuff posted on YouTube that people would discover through scrolling through stuff on Instagram or something. And in fact, we've been collaborating with a guy named Eric Hoyt, who's a professor in the Comm Arts department, who teaches video production to graduate students, to master's students. And Eric, this semester, set his students the task of making videos on Wisconsin 101 objects. And Kate, the managing editor, and I just looked at them. There were basically 5 to 6 minute videos that were fantastic, really interesting. And to me, that's the future for building an audience. How do you reduce these stories to sort of quick, lively, easy to digest stories about the project and about objects? We've also got a growing collaboration with the Wisconsin Historical Society. We have the appointment of Joy Huntington as a Mellon Graduate Fellow to work in their Office of Educational Services. I'll show you what that is in a second as soon as I get this off the page and I can put up the screen. What Joy is doing is creating and uploading teacher guides. In Wisconsin history is taught at the 4th grade level. And so we're hoping to create teacher guides for people going to the State Museum on the Square or to Old World, Wisconsin, that kind of highlight objects there and give the teachers additional resources for teaching those objects after the tour is over. And you may not know this, but the State Historical Museum is due to close in the next 3 years. They're going to build a bigger one. So there may be a case for Wisconsin 101 to be the museum while the museum is closed. And as I said, we're experimenting with new forms. One of our undergrad interns is working on a podcast. He's very ambitious. But I personally, I'm willing to be persuaded otherwise, but I think the future us lies in these shorter videos. Okay, just a couple more reflections. If building audience is a real interesting problem, because you're trying simultaneously to meet the interests of a group of older people who are already part of historical societies, work in museums as docents and volunteers. In other words, one group of your audience are people who are already interested enough in local history and who are engaged enough with it to want to pay attention to this stuff. But if you're also trying to build audience, if you're trying to get younger people to go into these museums, you've got to hit them with a different set of tools. And that's sort of where we are right now, is to use this stuff in a way that tries to kind of get people excited about history. And one more thing, why do we make this a state history, right? One of my classes, when I was teaching this, a student who was from Minnesota, you know, there are such people here at this place, said, well, can I write something about my hometown of Minnesota? And I said, no. And she said, why not? And I said, because it's not Wisconsin. And I explained that the reason for that is because bounding the project by the state makes sense because all of us identify as being from this state. It's a meaningful part of our lives, not necessarily the most important thing in our lives, but it means something that we're from this place as opposed to that place. And that's why a state history project, and that's why that's what the Maine Memory Network discovered too, right? Maine is a smaller state than Wisconsin, fewer people and so on, but it belongs as a Maine project and not as a New England project necessarily, and for obvious reasons. So I think that's it. I'm happy to hear your thoughts and responses. While we do that, I'm going to end this slideshow and put up the website. So fire away, please. That's the abandoned bowling alley in Yokohama. Isn't that amazing? I'll just add, our managing editor at the time, Adam Mandelman, who was a graduate student in geography, you know, I don't know, he was looking for photos, right? The managing editor has to add illustrations. And he found this picture, and he got a hold of the photographer and said, can we use this picture? And he said, absolutely. Isn't that something? It's just, wow. Yes?
Well, so did you ever hear about, like, there's a Twitter page or a Twitter contributor called History in Pictures. Incredibly popular, 2 million followers. I mean, they're kind of, some of their history has been a little dubious, I think, over time. But they, you know, here's a picture of Yuri Gagarin, or, you know, and it's just like once a day they post it, incredibly popular.
And what do they post along with the picture?
Almost nothing. I mean, just kind of
just a picture.
Just a picture, a description of Chicago North Line railway accident in 1953.
Yeah.
And the deal, but it's quite, you know, it's shallow. But there is this clickbait, you know, just something like a picture like that. It's something compelling.
Yeah.
Most of your subjects up there was something a little bit, really bowling pins and there's some little clickbait aspect to it. I think that's
that's actually that's an excellent point. And at our next regular meeting, we have a weekly kind of staff meeting. I want to bring that up. What this actually reminds me of are those old tear-off thing-a-day calendars where there would be a word or a joke or something or other. But you're absolutely right. What you really want to do is use those sort of things to drive some people to the main website. That's basically the idea. And the same thing with the videos, right? You like this, take a look at the website. And all we really want to do is just increase the number of people going to the website. So I think that's really an excellent idea, and I will. Here's our. So this is something we added recently. This is a mini tour of the State Historical Museum, and what we're doing is just highlighting a few of the objects that the students that the fourth graders most like to see, such as a pasty, a hand-powered vacuum cleaner. This vacuum cleaner was invented before houses were all electrified. And the language that we got describing this as world-famous Babcock Hall ice cream, we just kind of rewrote and said, this is stupid Midwestern boosterism. Babcock Hall ice cream is good. It's not world-famous. But anyway, you get this. What you're doing here is creating actually a little more than pictures. But there's also lesson plans that get uploaded, right? So here's kind of a reminder of what you saw, and then the teacher can use the lesson plan to remind the students after the tour or in preparation of the tour for this kind of thing. So this is one thing we've been trying, and there's going to be a lot more of this. We're going to be doing some stuff with Old World Wisconsin as well. Other questions? Yes, Eric.
So one of the things we've been trying to figure out over the course of this series of courses, and actually it was our theme last year, is what makes an idea a Wisconsin idea. So what is special about it? Bill Tracy, when he was here before, last week, was talking about, well, you know, other places have outreach, and is that really a Wisconsin idea? And what we've done over these years is accumulated some things that really do make it unique. A lot of them are associated with the history and how it started.
Yeah.
But what about now? And one of the comments that Jim had, that Bill had last week was that he felt there was a sort of environment here, a sort of a spirit, a culture here that was optimistic, that was empowering, and that accounted for some of the things that had come out of here. For example, the fact that so many people in the Peace, that were the #1 contributor to the Peace Corps, that political activities occur here in detail fairly regularly, that we have such a high-ranking university in many different regards, despite being a relatively small state, for example. And I would actually say that what you've done here, particularly since it sounds like it's not something that's widespread, might even be an example of that, that there's a certain initiative here that allows us or enables us or encourages us to go out and do something. What's your perspective on?
I have several. One is I think Bill's completely right that these ideas were formulated in the early 20th century when the state of Wisconsin was itself sort of infused with this progressivist idea, right? And so the state saw, and then as you guys may know, during the Great Depression, a lot of the important New Deal economic ideas came out of the Department of Economics here. So there was this sense of public service, which is completely undeniable. It also has to do with, but there are other units. So remember that in the Midwest, you have two different models for state universities. You have the Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota model, where the Arts and Humanities School and the Ag and Engineering School are the same school. And then you have the Iowa, Michigan, Indiana model, where they're separate, right? Purdue, Indiana, Michigan, Michigan State, and so on. And I think being all the same helps. I would argue that Minnesota has many of the same virtues in this way that Wisconsin does, because it is sort of, unlike Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where the school is sort of off in the middle of nowhere, and the real action's in Chicago. In the case of Minneapolis-St. Paul, you've got the school right there where the economic powerhouse of the state is. But there's another thing which I think is really distinctive about Wisconsin, which is the university is decentralized. It is everyone who, compared to other schools, it is famously anarchic. And I'll give you an example. My first year on the university committee, Tom said I was on this faculty executive committee for 3 years. My very first year, I went to a meeting of all the other schools called the CIC. That's the Consortium of Institutional Cooperation. It's just all the big universities in the Midwest, all the big publics plus the University of Chicago. And I would hear these stories from the other faculty representatives about how deans were hired with no search process, and just I mean, and I just said, that just never happens at Wisconsin. Never, except in medical school, which is sort of a thing unto itself. And it goes further than that, right? The school, the way power basically is very distributed. Deans have a lot of power, but so do departments. And so the power is really pushed down. And if you talk to past chancellors, they will tell you they often are frustrated by how hard it is to get stuff done. A good chancellor, and I would argue Becky Blank is a good chancellor, even though she is by disposition impatient, knows how to work with that and kind of mold it. All leaders do that, right? All leaders have to kind of get people to go along. But Wisconsin is very decentralized. That makes it look anarchic, but it also creates grassroots activism. At Wisconsin, no dean will ever say, you can't do that. A dean will say, well, you can do it, but I won't pay for it. But there is really a lot of grassroots activism, and I think that's what, for whatever reason, the school is not nearly as top heavy in the way power is distributed as a lot of universities are. I'll give you one other example. I hope this is okay for you guys. I did an external departmental review at of Indiana University a couple years back, and Indiana was one of the first universities to use what's called an RCM budget model, which is a model that says that funding follows student credits, right? Now, Wisconsin has gone to this to some extent, but Indiana really went for it. And what happened is that, in other words, funding from the administration goes to those units which are most successful in drawing student credits. And what has happened at Indiana is that their College of Arts and Sciences has been basically split off by fission because all these independent units start quarreling over money. Now, that happens at Wisconsin too, but there's also a big umbrella organization like the College of Letters and Sciences, which actually fosters collaboration because we're all sort of in the same boat. It's a very leaky boat. LNS is the biggest such college in the country by far, in part because it includes its music school and so on. And anyone who's in LNS knows it's not a very well-run ship, and I don't mean that as a knock on Carl Schultz. It's just never been a well-run ship. It's too leaky, it's messy. But messiness also leads to creativity and initiative. So I would say it's the culture of the university. And I think Becky Blank and Sarah Mangelsdorf would say the same thing. That was a long answer to the question.
It's all right.
If it, any other questions? Yes.
I kind of had a question on your these 3 to 5 minute videos that you were mentioning. Like,
yeah,
it sounds like the soundbite approach to the way everything's done now, just to catch something really quick. Are you going to have links that show how something got to that point and where it went from that, or is it going to be just like one of these snap judgment kind of things? Look at it. It could be fake news. Who knows? And I also kind of asked, if you could ask the students you have here what their thoughts are on that too, along with yours.
Okay, students. You haven't left for Thanksgiving yet, so you got to earn your credit. What do you think? Do you like the idea of short videos?
Yeah. New York Times just came out with this short videos where they were explaining about fake news. They were amazing. I mean, I watched all of them. They were addicting almost because they were everything was happening so fast, and the graphics and the design, and you also had someone talking about it and explaining it. So I could see how that could be really appealing because you get something, and you get, it's almost like podcasts, right? You get hooked into these and you want to continue watching.
Yeah. So I wish I could show you these videos that these ComArts grad students made. We don't have permission yet to post them, so because they're still doing final edits on them. They give you a lot more. 5 minutes is actually a long time. One of the videos was made about Paramount Records, which was the record company that published African-American blues, R&B, and jazz music in the 1920s in Port Washington, which hadn't seen an African-American person in ever. And so this weird story of how that happened is part of that. And it tells you some of that story, right? It tells you, it doesn't give you as much of the story as you would get by reading all 3 of the stories But it is a presentation of a historical narrative that's perfectly acceptable to academics like me. It's just not as in-depth or detailed or sourced. And someone asked me, it's funny, someone on the webinar asked me about fake news. Are you ever worried about the stuff that you get being unsourced? And well, in fact, all of our stuff is sourced. You have to, it's not like a Wikipedia article where it's all listed at the end, but in fact, it is sourced. And in fact, the stuff we're doing here, this is all pretty common stuff. This is all stuff that anyone who knows Wisconsin history knows. So, but I mean, I think one of the conclusions we've come to is that the most important thing to do is to get people engaged in thinking about the history of their place. And any way you can do that, in my opinion, is all to the good. And younger people like looking at stuff, and they like looking at stuff for 5 minutes. So why not try and appeal to that? Tom?
Well, I'm going to say, as a sociologist, I became a marketing guy. One of the things, it's not just driving traffic to the site, it's making the site sticky so that you want to stay there,
Yeah.
and you want to tell people about it, you want to use them to draw people to your site. So the stickiness...
And we want people to contribute eventually.
Yeah, because what you do, when you contribute, you get an endowment effect. You know, they have endowed the site with their own personality, and there's all this, research to show that makes a huge difference about how you feel about it. And then you become vested in it being yours. And
Correct.
It's kind of
That's what the main memory network did. Right,
idea,
right.
And so the extent to which you can get people to see it as our site, that there used to be,
the more notice it gets. And
when you went through the Brandenburg Gate or into East Germany, right after the '89 fall, but there was a cola that was only made in the East.
Right.
Even the East Berliners thought it tasted horrible,
but it's
but it
ours.
was their cola.
Yeah.
And they would not let go of that cola, and there was a sign, our cola.
Well, it's especially when they were losing everything else,
right?
right?
And
So, including their country.
You can make something, an imagined community, where you endow it with a sense of you as a Wisconsinite touching it, and and then I would probably go enlist the help of some famous Wisconsin filmmakers like Errol Morris or a documentarian, or even David Lynch lived here a while. I mean, people that were some Wisconsin connection, just to say, hey, this is a cool site.
Yeah, I agree. Remember, we're so stretched on our available resources. I'm retired, so I'm doing this volunteer work. Sarah Thal has never gotten a minute's release from her usual duties to do this. And did I remind you, she's a Japanese historian. So this all came on top of everything else we were doing. But you're absolutely right. And the one idea we had was actually getting fourth grade classes to curate an object. And now it wouldn't be posted on the main site because we've got to make clear for readers what level. But we're actually talking about writing stuff at different grade levels in order for different readers to. But again, you can have big plans, but you need time to make them work out.
Are you guys a 501(c)(3) or something? Can you take?
We have the only contributions that we can take would come through the history department.
But can people earmark that if somebody gives
They
them
can,
money
they
to
can, and
borrow,
but that, of course, the history department's own stance with respect to this project is somewhat ambivalent.
Right.
The chairs love it because it makes the history department look good to the Board of Visitors.
Right.
The rest of the department barely knows it exists. And so, it's a big department, and this gets to, so look, this is the politics of academia. The same reason why English departments don't want to be saddled with teaching basic composition to barely literate kids is the same reason why history departments don't necessarily want to be doing this, because it's kind of, in their view, demeans their work to be doing this basic stuff. And that's one reason why public history at the Wisconsin History Department has not always been welcomed. Even though William Cronin is a prominent public intellectual, nevertheless, well, I won't say more than that. Because I don't want to impute ideas to people where I really shouldn't be. But that's part of the problem. It's not an accident that a Japanese historian and an early modern Europeanist came up with this idea.
One last comment, and I'll shut up. My alma mater, the University of Texas Austin, did a smart thing with the Humanities Research Center group in there, but they had a lot of money, bought a Gutenberg Bible, but now it is, if you go to Austin, one of the places you want to go as a tourist is the HRC, because they always have, like they just had
a show,
some anniversary of Gone with the Wind. So
yeah.
They had David Selznick told, they created part of the set, Gone with the Wind, in this building, and people paid.
They made it a tourist destination, basically.
They made it a tourist destination, and they made the popular culture part of it. What pays the rent on the first floor, what pays for the collections and the scholarship on the 5th and 6th floor.
Yeah. Remember, the Center for the Humanities here does an awful lot of public outreach programs. Big focus on humanities lectures that bring in prominent intellectuals. They do actually a statewide program where kids come from all over the state with their teachers to read a famous book. I remember a book of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I remember this one because I'm an Enlightenment historian. I mean, however, most of those programs reach only Dane County. I mean, to be honest, I'm sure people come from further outside, but they're mostly focused on the area around Madison. And we very much wanted to get away from that because it gets back to the same problem of Madison's relationship with the rest of the state. I think we solved that problem. I'm really proud of that. This does not look like a Madison project. And it's partly because we're piggybacking on the State Historical Society, which itself is sort of all over the state. So, I mean, that kind of outreach, but I don't think we should diminish the amount of humanities-related outreach that the university already does. But to me, very little of it is statewide. So. Any other questions? Eric?
Is there now another project like this? You said Maine existed, you found that?
Not to my knowledge. I haven't looked recently. I was very gratified that on this webinar I gave recently, there were 15 people from other states. If someone else was inspired to do something like this, it would be great. If they paid license. I've got this, I registered for a patent with WARF, so I'm expecting to make big money off this by licensing it to the other 49 states.
So why do you think that the two of you came up with it here? Was it you? Is it?
It was the moment. It was the moment. It was the political moment, and this attack on history as a public good, right?
And I think Bill Tracy might say that that's potentially an example of people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Something that everyone else just complains about.
Yeah, no, well, you could find that everywhere, Eric.
Yeah.
But it's partly me. I'll sometime tell you about another idea I came up with, which never quite worked. But anyway, it is the moment, the opportunity, the kind of school that says, and remember, we went to LNS and they gave us this PA, and believe me, 50% 12-month PAs are not cheap. So, that's the kind of support we got. And anyway, so yeah.
So we have to close now, but I want to end with one comment. My daughter got a history degree from the campus here, and she got an outstanding job in business.
Look, Drew Peterson, the incoming president of the Board of Regents, starting in June, like me, went to Ripon College. He was a history major. Ask him what his history major was worth, and he'll say, it taught me to learn to do stuff. He is the biggest defender of this stuff you'll meet. So, yeah.